everyone. I'm Kelly Yang, and I'm the author of Front Desk, which is this book right here, and Three Keys, as well as Parachutes, my YA. And I'm so excited to be moderating this panel for you guys today. It's called Middle Grade Authors, Putting Yourself on the Page. And we are so lucky to have some of the best writers, some of the biggest voices, some of the most amazing women writing in middle grade with me today, including Aida Salazar, Veera Hiranandani, Jasmine Warga, and Alicia Williams. So I'm going to introduce them individually, and then we're going to get into a discussion about putting yourself on the page. So Aida Salazar is an arts activist and an award-winning author of the novels The Moon Within, which was really amazing, one of my favorite books, and the critically acclaimed Land of the Cranes. Veera is the author of The Night Diary, which is this book right here. It won the Newbery Honor Award along with many other awards. She's also the author of The Whole Story of Half a Girl and the chapter book series BBG Green. Jasmine Warga is the author of Other Words for Home. This is my copy, and it actually was given to me by Mr. Shu, and it says, to Kelly from John Shu. I love this book with my whole heart. This book also won a John Newbery Honor and many other awards as well. She's also the author of the young adult books My Heart and Other Black Holes, as well as Here We Are Now. Alicia Williams is the author of The Genesis Begins Again, which also won a John Newbery Honor, as well as the Coretta Scott King John Steptoe New Talent Award. It's an amazing book. I can't wait to be talking with these wonderful authors, and we're going to start off with one of the hardest questions that I've ever gotten, which is, what is it like putting yourself on the page, and why is it so difficult? So Aida, do you want to kick it off for us?
Sure, absolutely. Well, actually, I don't have that problem. I don't have a problem of putting myself on the page. I write from a very intimate place. I always write from as close to my experience as I possibly can, because I think about myself as a child. I think about my children and other children like them who haven't had the opportunity to see themselves and to experience their lives mirrored on the page. So I try really hard to bring as much authenticity and to create very vivid feelings and scenarios and circumstances so that the kids can experience that. And because I think ultimately those are transformative moments, and that's my whole shtick. I want to make sure that kids feel not only see themselves, but feel transformed and inspired through text.
Wow. And so, I mean, for you, the process is just a natural one where you don't really hold back, you just put it all out there. And there's never a moment where you're like, because for me, definitely, and I don't know how many of you guys agree with me, but there's definitely a moment where I look back at the writing and I'm like, oh, like, what have I done? Jasmine, what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, it was a little bit difficult to get started just because I felt so invisible as a kid in books. And when you feel invisible, you don't think of yourself as having a story or people like you being main characters. And so I think it took me a while to kind of reconfigure that in my head. And then beyond that, just the vulnerability of it. I think all writing, no matter how close the character's life is to yours, there's a piece of you in it and your heart is on the page, and that's obviously what we're all here to do. And like Aida said, we're here to give that to kids, but I think there's something inherently scary about putting your heart and your blood on the page, and then also how that's going to be interpreted by the people closest to you in your life is something I think about a lot.
Absolutely. And I love that you touched on that. I mean, the best books, I think, show us the author's heart. And Alicia, that's something you do so well. And it is just such an honor to be in conversation with you. And it's, I mean, I am in awe of your bravery. So tell us a little bit about that process for you.
Kelly, you're gonna make my head too big for my shoulders. there were two parts. I think it wasn't hard to do it, but going through it was a little bit of a challenge for me, because recalling moments that were laughable, you know, you can enjoy those, but when you conjure up those moments that cause pain or even trauma, it was how to release that. Releasing it on the paper is one, but also releasing it in real life, because the colorism issue, I carried that as an adult and I experienced it while I wrote it. And so it was hard to not become even more sensitive to it when it occurred. And then after it came out, I felt so exposed, especially being a teacher. I thought, okay, this might be too much, because I don't want people reading into it as this is my exact life. No, and they read into it, and I don't want students like, oh yeah, Genesis is you, and you went through exactly this. And I'm like, no, too much information. No, I'm not Genesis, you know? So it was a balancing act on how to move forward through it and how people would perceive it.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important there. We're going to come back to that later about protecting yourself. And I certainly have totally relate to what you're saying, because people come up to me all the time and they're like, you're Mia Tang. And I'm like, well, you know, not 100%, but I definitely drew a lot from personal experience. But I want to go to Veera, because Veera, you have one of the most ambitious and incredible books I've ever read. It is so, so important. I mean, this part of history is it's often overlooked, but it's so critical, and it talks so much about identity and power and all the dynamics that were going on. What was it like for you? This was not your autobiographical story, but it drew a lot from your father and your family. And what was that like, putting that family history onto the page?
Well, it wasn't easy. It was my first book was very much based on my own experiences growing up. So this was that sort of, I felt deeply connected to the history, but obviously I didn't experience it myself. So it was definitely a lot of, am I allowed to do this? Giving myself that permission. And then, you know, allowing myself to become these characters, walking through a period of time and trying to imagine what that felt like. And we all do that, I guess, with fictional characters, because we're writing fiction, and then putting ourselves into those characters. But as I'm sure you all know, it's sort of like, it's not completely lined up. You know, there's a lot of me and Misha and the main character, but there's me and the father character, there's me and the brother character, you know, there's all these places that I'm like hiding all over the book in a way.
Was it hard in terms of, I mean, because I mean, I'm so in love with your book, and I think it's so incredibly well done. And one of the things is writing about something that isn't often written about, and feeling a certain responsibility to, you know, to these characters, to this part in history. And I certainly had that with Front Desk. You know, this was a part of immigration history that wasn't talked about a lot. And what was it like for you, you know, sifting through that responsibility, but still giving yourself the permission to be creative, to let your imagination go?
Yeah, it was just a step-by-step process. So I would sort of, you know, do the research I had to do, but then just let myself experience the story. And I remember I tell this story often. My mom, you know, I was talking to her about the challenges of, you know, am I going to do this piece of history justice, really? You know, what am I really trying to do here? I want to preserve it. I want other people to know about this history. I don't want it to be lost. But I'm not a historian. I'm not an academic. And so she sent me this quote from E.L. Doctorow that said, you know, the historian's job is to tell you what happened, and I think it's the novelist's job is to tell you what it felt like. And so that really helped me understand what my purpose was, of just what it would feel like for an ordinary family going through this extraordinary time. And there are so many parallels in all of your work and what we're going through now. And, you know, so yeah.
Definitely. And I think that I totally relate to that. I mean, in writing Front Desk and Three Keys, my parents initially were like, why are you putting this kind of embarrassing part of our life on the page? You know, and I can understand their concern, because I was taking all these stories that, you know, I'd heard as a kid, but were like legitimately embarrassing, and putting them out there. And I said to my mom, like, well, listen, if I don't do this, it might get erased from history. Like, it's so easy to just go throughout history and just not cover this little part of history, you know, not cover this part where immigrants came over from China with $300 in their pocket, but they were like highly educated, but they were like totally exploited once they got here, right? Or not cover this part of history of India and Pakistan. And if I can't let that happen where it just gets erased, you know, because that's such a real possibility. And did that go through any of your guys' head when you were writing it? Is just feeling not only your job as an author, but your job as a historian. I mean, we really did have to fill those shoes. And especially, I'm really interested in Aida, because your book is touching on such an important and such a timely issue that's just affecting so many people today, even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, absolutely. I think that any conscientious writer carries that burden, right? We carry the burden of representation, especially authors of color. I think perhaps even more so. This making sure that we get it right is critical. And why is that critical? Is because we do not want to harm children. We don't want them to see something about themselves that will harm them, either, you know, psychically or mentally or in any way. So so absolutely, when I decided to write this book, it actually came to me in a very kind of muse to author way, and I wrote it as if the little girl was there. You know, I was like her personal secretary, and I was writing it all down. And then it was only after it was written that I went back and started to do the research. And so I feel like there was this symbiotic relationship that I had with the muse and history and accuracy. And I really relied on journalism, because I did not feel like I was qualified to interview children who had experienced this level of trauma. I didn't want to further traumatize them by my questions, or even, you know, being in a conversation with them. So I really relied on journalists and the historians of the time, right, to kind of give me all of that information. But you know, the political implications of what we're writing, of what I feel like I'm writing right now, are just what Veera said, right? It's what people feel, you know, because it does become this kind of monolithic, separated construct, right? We have people in detention, there are kids in cages, and like, oh, how unfathomable, but what does it feel like, right? Like, so how does this child process what they're feeling? And in my particular way, through this book, I was hoping to do it through her poetry, and if there is no greater witness to pain and to tragedy than the child, the voice of a child, then, you know, then and we don't respond, then we've lost, you know, all hope, I think.
Right. Okay, I want to go back to something that Alicia said, which I thought was so important, which is, you know, when we put ourselves out there, we're making art, you know, but we're infusing that art with our own struggles. Sometimes when we're being judged, it almost feels like you're judging our life a little bit, not just our craft. And also, even if we do a masterful job, the fact that so many people know these intimate details about our life, and then they come back and they're like, I know everything about you because I read your book. And it's like, it's hard, right? And so how do you protect yourself a little bit from the process, or from reviewers, or from, you know, from the readers, or from the fans? Like, how do you protect yourself a little bit? And let's start with Alicia, since you came up with this amazing point.
Did I? Well, you know, I didn't realize I needed protection at first in the writing of it. And colorism, for those who don't know, in the audience is discrimination within one's community based on skin color, light and darkness. In writing the story, it's a universal story. And I do recall being a victim of colorism. But as an adult, we tend to push whatever trauma or whatever bad experiences behind, and we keep it moving. You know, life happens. But as writing the story, it's like a abrasive reminder that no, you haven't dealt with this. I remember being in the restaurant and with a cousin that was ambiguous looking, and I was totally ignored. And they asked her what she wanted, and I was like, I'm thirsty, just because she's beautiful and light skinned, and I felt so invisible, especially, or dateable, unlovable. So I started feeling too close to the story. So I had to back out. And to make it not my own and to protect myself, I had to divorce myself from the story. When I mean divorce myself, I had to make Genesis so different in character from me that I had to part ways. Like, Alicia would not do this, but Genesis would do this. Genesis had to have her own choices, her own way of life. And I could not impede on that because of what pain I was going through and dealing with. So when I say protect that, protect it. And actually speaking about it to other people, when I started having conversations and I saw that other people were dealing with these issues in a way and how they dealt with it, it became a cocoon. Like, okay, I really need to involve this person's story in it some way. So it wasn't my story anymore. So the protection of it was a barrier from it was like a supersonic power, right? Because I knew that I was using their voices to infuse in this story instead of just my memories or my personal experiences all along. Because if I did that, I would be so crushed, especially like you said, when reviewers come out and they say, you know, this isn't your experience. And I was so afraid that people of color who experience colorism would say, this is something that did not happen. This is not the right way you wrote it. And I had to, if I made it mine, then it would have definitely got those attacks because it would have been my personal story.
Right. That's a really good way of thinking about it. What about for you, Veera?
Well, you know, it's almost a little bit of the opposite in the sense that I wasn't necessarily writing about my personal story. I started out writing very much my father's story, and a male main character and kind of this young boy going through it. And I felt too close in a way. It's sort of like the same and different, too close to my father's personal story and my family's personal story, because through my research, I wanted to bring in other elements. And my father is a Hindu family, and I wanted Nisha's mother to be Muslim and her father to be Hindu and seen as a Hindu family, because that was what I was most familiar with as far as the journey and the direction that they went. But I was also trying to bring in this other aspect of, you know, multiple identities and her country being split apart. And if she had a connection to both sides, where would she belong? So anyway, I started with the male main character, and then I said, you know what, I need to change it. I actually need to make the character more like me in a way to somehow give me the freedom to create my own story and not just my father's story. So I sort of moved him over and then created Nisha, and he became her brother, her twin brother.
That is so fascinating, because I've been trying to tell this front desk story for years and years and years too. And not necessarily always in middle grade, but I had tried all these different things. And I remember I wrote like a short story from the dad's perspective initially, because I was trying to tell my parents' story.
Right.
And then I think I queried like some agents and said, okay, I've got this YA. It's told from the perspective of a 38-year-old man. And we were like, what? I had no idea what I was doing. It was only later when I was writing it for my son that I found Mia. But it's so interesting. And when she came along, it really opened the story up, because I was so worried about not getting my father's struggle, my parents' struggle right, that it almost became like nonfiction, you know?
Right.
But what about you, Jasmine?
Yeah, I mean, I related to so much of what I've heard all of you say. I think, again, it's a combination. And Alicia really touched on something that I relate to about this fear of people not feeling like they saw their exact story in it, because I think all of us feel this pressure to get the story right, but we're also writing a singular story. And so for me, how I've combated that own anxiety is trying to like boost other writers of color, because I think all of us feel really passionate about wanting to see more and more stories so that we don't feel like our book is the only one that covers that territory or does that territory. Because what I thought a lot about while I was working on Other Words for Home is how Jude has a very, very specific refugee story, because it was the only refugee story that I felt qualified to write or that I could do justice to, because it was the story that I knew in my own community of a refugee who has this privilege of already having family here in America, and that was the people who I know and I have access to talk to, especially when you're writing, as Veera touched on, an experience that you haven't had yourself. And so I thought a lot about how sometimes we narrow stories in order to make them feel more universal. And then things that changed about Jude, or in ways I guess that she's so different from me, or that she has like a confidence that I definitely didn't have as a young person, but I wrote that because that's what I would have needed to see when I was 11 or 12. This girl who really believes in herself and thinks she deserves to be up on stage, and you kind of see that in the dynamic thinking that she could be in the school play because has already internalized this idea of what kind of kid is the star, but Jude doesn't have that kind of baggage. And so I wanted to play around with that, and sort of, it was cathartic in a way to write someone who had a type of confidence that I definitely didn't have as a young person. That was almost like a form of kind of self-love that I was hoping to give to other kids.
I love that. That's so beautiful, and definitely something we can all relate to. What about you, Aida? How do you protect yourself from the process a little bit, you know, especially because it is so personal to you? It's such an incredible story. And I'm sure, you know, during that process of writing it, you know, were you worried about what people were going to say, and how do you protect yourself from those little thoughts?
Well, you know, my book is an immigrant story that came after American Dirt. So the way that that the book has been positioned, and the way that kind of I had to armor myself in it to defend it has been by connecting it to my own undocumented experience of having been brought over to you know, to the United States when I was 9 months old and living as an undocumented child. And so I had to qualify it, and instead of kind of backing away and distancing myself from the character, I had to make very strong connections. And like you said, Jasmine, I had to qualify the reason why I was the person to write this story. And, you know, the way that I kind of responded to this concept of a single story is by also amplifying other voices. And, you know, Chimamanda Ngozi said that there is a danger in the single story. And so we have to, I think, elevate other authors who are doing the same. And, you know, my launch for Land of the Cranes was a conversation with, you know, 6 other authors who have all written about the immigrant experience from the Latinx perspective. And so, you know, instead of protecting myself, I've had to kind of catapult myself and in front of my work in a way to kind of almost defend it. So wow. It's been a little bit of a different.
That's so interesting, and you know, it's heroic, it's empowering, you know, and I think those of us who've had to do it, it's been a little terrifying. I know I can attest to that. It's been a little terrifying, but it's also worked out in really beautiful ways. And I want to ask, you know, since your book's been out, how has your life changed? Like, how has the story changed you, and how has it changed your life? Or has it? Let's start with Jasmine.
Yeah, I would say, and again, this is touching on things other people said, I've had to come to terms with my own complicated feelings about my identity and traumas from my childhood, just because, well, before coronavirus, I was doing lots of school visits, and I would go in and I would talk about myself as a middle schooler, and I realized that a lot of that, like, I'd shut in this like really small space and hadn't inside of myself and hadn't let myself come to terms with all of these complicated questions of identity. Because I think in some ways I felt, so I was in 8th grade when 9/11 happened, and all the messaging I felt like was telling me you could either be American or you could be Arab, and you could be American or you could be Muslim. And this was a way to kind of braid those hyphenated identities together. And then when I go to school visits, I talk about that a lot. But I think that it's changed me and having to more actively think about how I identify, about issues of my own faith, about, because you get asked questions from kids and you want to be able to be honest with them and give them full answers, but some of the things become really, personal, and they weren't things I thought about. But the other thing would be just how amazing it is to me to think for my like middle school self of the book being read by so many kids, because again, like I talked about at the beginning, I felt so invisible as a kid and didn't think that like I was the type of person who was a heroine and had all these kind of views. And so even when I was writing Other Words for Home, I thought, oh my gosh, this is like such a niche story, and it's too Arab or it's too Muslim or it's not, I think that I sort of underestimated myself and my identity. And so the book has taught me to not do that. And I hope that's what it's done for other, Muslim kids.
It's so beautiful. It's exactly right? Like we underestimate ourselves constantly. I think I can speak for all of us. Like at least for myself, I can say that I never expected so many kids to resonate with the story that I wrote, because I didn't really think that there were that many people going through these things, but there just are so many people going through these issues. And so it's really,
yeah, sorry not to cut you off, but I think like for you, it's probably the same thing as me too, that kids who even haven't gone through those issues want to read and want to empathize. And I think that's
Absolutely.
like a really empowering thing to learn.
Absolutely. What about you, Veera? How has this changed you or changed your life?
Oh gosh, in so many ways. I mean, I'm just so grateful for the reception. And one of the most important things that have happened is South Asian families reading the book, a young person reading the book and their parent and then their grandparent. And usually the grandparent is the person that has the connection, a partition survivor. And partition's really hard to talk about. And often people who have been through it don't want to talk about it. So I had to be, when I was talking to family members and friends of family members, I had to be really sensitive of who might want to share their traumatic stories or not. And so that was always something I was navigating. But then to see the multi-generational kind of embracing of the story, and then the story gave them an easier way to kind of talk about it, about what happened. Hearing stories like that just blow me away. And it's really the first reason I wrote the book. And it was also healing for me in the sense that being biracial, and my mother's white and Jewish, and having that background, I tend to always feel sort of not enough of one thing or another, but I did feel very connected and curious about this part of my family history. And then to have it, I feel accepted. I feel like I can be both things. And now I'm writing a Jewish character and kind of going through all of those feelings again. But I'm doing this for myself to sort of discover who I am, to be sort of both things rather than kind of half or not enough. And right. I'm sure many people can relate in different ways.
Absolutely. How about you, Aida?
Oh, I was just riveted. I'm sorry. Um, well, I think it's just it's activated me maybe a little more. I've been an activist for a really long time, but in this political moment, I really feel like the book is kind of my call to action. It's meant for people to not only see a mirror or a window, but really to have agency, for people to say, ah, this is a roadmap. If this little girl, Betita, at 9 years old, can find her voice through writing picture poems, this poetry and these picture combinations, and make a change within the very dark, terrible circumstances, then I can too. And that to me, I really wanted that to come across, and I have to kind of stand by it. So I'm feeling like a little more empowered by it. And I don't know what the resonance is yet, because it's only been out for a few weeks, and so like I don't know. I know that some people have had very uh, deep responses to the book, but I haven't had the opportunity to really exchange with folks around it. But my hope is that they're gonna activate, and they're gonna find the agency in themselves.
They will. They absolutely, girl, they will. I totally believe it. Alicia, what about you?
I wish I could say I had the big head walking around here, but I don't. I mean, I never expected the book to have the reception like you all said, but I'm so balanced because I go to a school where my kids, they don't care. They don't, they don't care. They don't even know. Half of them don't even acknowledge I'm a writer. I'm like, do you know who I am? But I want to say, outside of my day job, it has given me hope. I remember when the book was coming out, and my mom said, do you think anyone will read this, anyone outside of Black little girls? And I had this panic moment, because yes, on the cover is a Black little girl with the 3 stripes. And yes, it's a middle grade 13-year-old Black girl. Oh my gosh, my audience is gonna only be 13-year-old Black girls. So there was this panic in it, because I knew the message was so much more. And it's given me hope, because I have not just only middle grade Black girls, I have middle grade white girls, boys, and of the gamut culturally, high schoolers. I have, adults who said, oh my gosh, this is the book I've been wanting for my life, or this is a book that told me that this thing even exists. So to have this story in the hands of people that I would have never dreamed of is giving me hope, because colorism is this story that we don't talk about. Internalized racism, we don't talk about, or where it comes from, we don't discuss. We may attack each other in our own families, in our own communities, and we do it generation after generation, but we don't talk about it. So it's giving me hope that we can kind of tackle this idea of doing it, because I know I felt like I was not worthy. Growing up, I felt like I was not worthy of love. I wasn't lovable. And it stemmed from feeling ugly, too dark, my hair being too nappy, and comparing myself to what is deemed beautiful. And I just hope, because I had been in kindergarten for 6 years and I was writing a book, and I've told this story where I knew we saw our kids of color, our brown kids and Black kids, would not choose a crayon that matched their skin tone. And so that means we haven't done a job in emphasizing that they're good enough, that they're valuable, their self-worth is not based on the skin tone. So I'm so appreciative being part of this panel, because we all have these powerful, life-changing stories, and we are given hope, and we give encouragement. And I think that's, for me, how it changed, that hopefully that we have these tough conversations.
Absolutely. And I want to touch on what you said, earlier just now, about how your mom was like, is it only going to be read by Black girls? And my mom was very much the same way. She was like, why would white people want to read about this little Chinese girl? That's what she said. And she couldn't believe it. And you know what? And I had to respond. And I remember when she asked this question, I was kind of like, so what? If it's just Chinese girls reading this book, why is that any worse? You know, and it really made me think about all the things, you know, growing up where my parents would always put the priority on like what white people liked. This is what was successful. This is when you made it. This is what respect looks like. And all these other things that we do, they're not really, you know, to be respected or to be looked, you know, favorably upon or whatever. So we have to hide them. Like the fact that we work in a motel, like the fact that we don't live in a big house, we don't have a dog, all these things.
Isn't it interesting? Because it's in our community too. What is valuable is to ascertain what white acceptance, right? Whether it's our looks or the education or the extracurricular activities that we do, is valuable to get that approval. So it's the same thing. That's amazing.
Absolutely. And, you know, and so I always talk about this because what was really moving of all the school visits I went to, what was really moving was I remember once I went to a school and this kid put a little note in my purse, and I didn't open it then. I waited until I got back to the hotel, and I opened it and it said, because of front desk, I told one person at my school that my parents work in a restaurant. And I was just like, wow, you know, like that is more meaningful to me than any award they can give me. You know, that's just so meaningful because I was that kid who like hid it from everybody because it was so, I was told it was really embarrassing. So I believed it. Okay, so now we're just getting emotional. All of our novels tackle difficult circumstances, but they manage to instill hope. And it's really hard these days, you know, to find the hope because our world is literally on fire. How do you find the hope? And, you know, how do you put it into your writing even during these challenging times? Let's start with Veera.
Well, getting harder by the day. I think it's why I've always been attracted to stories. You know, I was definitely kind of a dreamy kid, quiet, introverted, but sort of captured by stories in all different forms. Movies, plays, poems, and I was always kind of making stuff up and sort of in a fantasy world, but I think it was because I would have questions or see things that I didn't think were okay or feel bad about myself or feel really different in the environment that I was in. And so the stories would like, how can I kind of confront these questions, but then have the ending that I want to have in a way. And it was just always an empowering thing to make stuff up. And so I think I've just been naturally attracted to the idea of hope and, you know, how else can we kind of put one foot in front of the other? So yeah, I don't even know if I actually give an answer or I sometimes I forget where I started.
What about you, Aida?
You know, I always go back to what Toni Morrison said. She said, you know, this is the time when, I can't remember exactly what time she was responding to, but she said, this is the time that artists get to work. This is not a time to despair. And I really hold on to that. And I use it as a sort of mantra, you know, that the moment that we give up hope, then they won. Right. And they've succeeded in fully oppressing us and fully silencing us or marginalizing us and disenfranchising us. And so I always lean on my writing as a tool for liberation. And if I don't have that, then I'm done for. But while I have my writing and while I can find publishers who are willing to put the work out, then I'm doing the work, and that's incredibly hopeful for me. And I should say also that I always keep my eye on the prize, and that's the reader, because, you know, there's this Mexican saying that says they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds, and our children are that. And if we provide literature that is transformative, that is inspiring, that is agency enabling, then, you know, we've got it, you know, we've got the hope and we've got those seeds. Right there.
Absolutely. How about you, Jasmine?
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. What I was going to say is it's young people for me. I think about the school visits that I went on, and these, like, lots of teachers will have the students write, you know, feedback letters afterwards, and the ones from especially like middle school white boys in rural communities that would say things like, I used to be afraid of Muslims, or I didn't understand, and now I realize like how lucky I am, and I want to learn how to be more welcoming, or just things you see how big-hearted young people are, and as Ada said, if we provide them with this literature, I really have hope for the future. And then just also my own children, I think about when lockdown started, and I was walking around the neighborhood, and my daughter, who she was about to turn 3, says, "Do you hear that, mommy?" And she was talking about the bird, and she was like, "The birds are still singing, so I know everything's going to be okay." And yeah, so I think about that young people are a source of hope, and that they are going to remake our world. And so I think that inspires me to sit down at my desk and try to create that kind of work. It's writing for young people in a way. It's a way to write into the future moment, right? And so that helps me to not just despair, I guess.
I love it. I love it so much. What about you, Alicia?
Yes, I feel like Vera, you know, hope has always been hard this summer since quarantine. I had to be honest, I struggle with it. I made a mistake of watching Ahmaud Arbery's video of being shot down, and I was no good. And then, you know, George Floyd, and then Breonna. It was just one thing after another, and I paced back and forth the hallway, forgetting what I walked here for. I just couldn't get it together. I couldn't write a paragraph to save my life. And I realized that I was losing hope. I was losing faith because of the anger, because of the frustration, because of people not having empathy. And I had to pull back because I suffer from depression and anxiety. I had to pull back, stay off social media and personal opinions to say, I need to focus my attention on what counts. And like Aida says, it's the writing, it's the saving, telling these stories that's going to impact the lives, it's going to impact the future. Because if I give away all my energy to fighting little battles on Facebook or social media, I'm not doing the work. So I protect myself. I would burn my incense or whatever, and I get quiet, and I write now. I write.
That's beautiful. Yeah, for me, it's just going back to, you know, my childhood. It was a very hard childhood. There were many, many times where we felt pretty hopeless. But what got us through were all these stories. You know, they would be funny, and that little burst of humor, it just made my day. You know, so if I can just continue on and give kids, you know, stories that are full of joy and hope, but also talk about some of these issues, difficult, very real issues we go through, that gives me hope. Yeah. And so we have about 7 minutes left, and I want to throw this question out to all of us. And this is a question that I originally wrote for Aida, which is, you know, we don't know who's going to win the presidential election, but if you had a message for the new president of the United States, what would your message be? Let's start with Aida.
My new president, I would say, don't let us down. That you have the power to sway the nation in a way that is positive, in a way that is benevolent, and that is going to bring about justice. These works that we make, the work that I make, is an offering in that work, and don't let the children down.
Great. How about you, Jasmine?
Mine would just be to please love all of our children and have the messaging from the White House be that all of our kids are worthy of love, because all of our kids need to know that. And I don't feel like that's the strength that they're getting right now. And I think that would just be a really powerful thing to, I would just ask the president to be the president for all of America and for every single person who lives here.
Okay, how about you, Alicia?
I have to take that president, that president to the high top. Like, let me show you what's going on in this country, all over. Like Veera said, all the little, and you said the little fires everywhere. Now, you see all of these things happening. How are you going to instill hope? We just talked about it. How, in a hopeless country right now, how are you going to instill hope? It's not about you. It's not about the Republicans. It's not about the Democrats. Not about this. Not about that. How are you going to instill hope? Because after you gone, our kids got to deal with it. So what you're going to do?
I love that. That's so important. What about you, Veera?
As you can see, my son is coming in. I'm trying to figure out how to, but I'm still here, even though it's foggy. It's a hard question. To respect, the power of the office, and the more respect you show that power, sort of the more respect you show all of us. And so, so that's what I hope for, that cultural change. Yeah.
And I hope that the new president reads all our books, because you cannot read these books and not have some empathy instilled in you at the end. Cannot read these books and not understand and not see through a mirror or a window into the lives of all these wonderful kids going through these very hard issues right now, and not be a better person at the end. So I hope we can all hold up our books. Let's hold up our books, and so we can show everyone these amazing stories. I really do think are helping to make the world a better place.